Good morning and welcome. Today we'll be reviewing two methods of migrating insurance documents, lift and shift or optimized methodization. My name is Hanson Longfellow and I'm a senior account manager at Bellevue, and I will be your moderator today. We know this is a very busy time of year for you, and to honor your time today, we're asking to take all questions at the end. With that, I'm going to be handing the presentation over to James Taylor, CCM Implementation Lead. James has handled several migration projects and has some things to think about, as well as two case studies for you to review. James?
Thanks, Hanson, for the introduction. And as you said, today's webinar, we're covering the topic of insurance migration, specifically two different methods to migrate those documents. The first method being what we're calling a lift and shift, and the second method being the optimized method. So let's get started. First of all, I want to tell you briefly about why we see people migrating those insurance documents. You may be asking yourself, is it time for me to migrate? And here are some of the big reasons why we see that. First of all, legacy technologies. Many insurers may have some technologies in place that have been there for even 30 years. They may not be supported anymore. It's possible they're coming to the end of life where they won't be supported in the future. Or also there may be some proprietary solutions involved where the people who designed those and coded those many years ago may no longer be available. A second reason we see migrations is a production shift. So you might be changing print vendors. You might decide that you want to outsource the actual composition of your print files themselves to a vendor, or possibly you want to bring in-house the composition of the actual print files themselves. A third reason to migrate is compliance risk. There is quite a bit of legacy content, of course, out there that's been there for several years. And especially if that content has been customized, if you have policies that have been customized, it tends to be quite difficult over the years to keep track of whether that's still compliant. We have something that I term the retirement brain drain, and many companies may be experiencing that some of their experts who have worked on these legacy systems over the years, worked with these systems daily, are, they may be heading off to an RV or to Florida, and their retirement, leaving potentially a black box, a technical black box where people don't really understand it or don't want to touch it. And many insurers see this as an opportunity to really shift some of that responsibility, at least for content, over to their subject matter experts. And a final reason here that I have why insurers are migrating is that there's a trend towards moving to omni-channel in terms of communications. And by omni-channel, we mean something like a bicycle wheel, where you can imagine it has many spokes going into and out of one central hub. And so with omni-channel, insurers are improving their customer experience and really trying to differentiate themselves in terms of offering better experience to their customers. It also really helps in terms of allowing customers to do self-service, especially important in times like these and in the pandemic. And of course, we all like to get paid, and paid promptly or paid as soon as possible. And that omni-channel offers enough coordination and enough channel options so that you can actually receive payment earlier just by offering your customers easier ways of payment or more preferred ways of payment. So let's actually compare the two migration strategies that we want to talk about today. And the first strategy that we'll talk about is called lift and shift. You can imagine this as being something like a forklift, and it comes and it picks up your content and all of the rules and everything behind it, and it moves it over and drops it down onto a new, more modern or more capable CCM platform. And so the pros of doing a lift and shift where you're kind of picking up and then moving over to a new platform, first of all, it's probably a less expensive approach than the other approach I'll talk about later, at least in the short term. A related item number two is that you could probably reduce the implementation time, again, in comparison to the other migration option, which I'll talk about later. These are both related to having probably less discovery, less coordination, less communication necessary to do the lift and shift. The third advantage, or the third pro to this lift and shift approach, is that potentially an insurer could avoid refiling their documents. And of course, that's always a big topic whenever you undertake one of these migrations. A fourth reason, and very important one, is you could use comparison tools, automated comparison tools, to really help with the quality assurance of the migration itself. So a person could, under the lift and shift approach, take output from the legacy system, take output from the new platform, and compare those two in an automated way and say, are these two the same or are they different, right? And the output of the lift and shift approach would typically, you would be looking for them to be the same between the legacy system and the new system. So as you can see, points 3 and 4, already we're talking about things that not only probably are less cost, but also less time to implement. And the last point, the last lift and shift advantage I have for you is that you could really reduce what I call the blast radius. It gives you more control over the effects of the migration and how widespread those effects are, so that you can try to sort of contain the effects and not have such a widespread effect on different stakeholders, different departments throughout your organization. So many people would see 0.5 as an advantage. Now let's look at some of the advantages for the second option. We're calling it the optimized option. The first I have is, of course, a very important one, especially when you're talking or justifying these things to the C-suite management, and that is return on investment. And that's a long-term goal, and it's something that's, of course, very important to most companies to know that the expense that you're incurring, which can be quite significant for these migrations, that expense over time can be returned if you take more of an optimized approach. A second advantage here is that it gives you the omni-channel customer experience that so many insurers are trying to move towards. And by that, again, we mean a bicycle wheel where all of your different channels are very coordinated under one hub, and you really need one skill set throughout the entire organization to be able to have this kind of omni-channel customer experience, as opposed to many different skill sets as you may have now. This allows insurers to really kind of differentiate themselves from competition in terms of having a better customer experience. And increasingly, it's actually not so much a differentiation factor as it is a making sure that we're at least in line with our competition and what they're doing. A third advantage here when you optimize is that you can update and share content. And this has to do with document rationalization, is the term that people oftentimes use around this. In terms of updating content, this gives you the opportunity to make sure that your content is still relevant for 2021. And when we talk about sharing content, what we're saying is that you may have documents that have the same content, and instead of having 50 different documents and storing that same content 50 different times, the idea here is that you would identify those areas where the content is the same throughout many documents, and you would store that common content one time, and you would have it sort of cascade down to whatever documents it needs to be in. And that way you're only having to edit things one time, and you can really ensure that that content is always consistent throughout all of your documents. A fourth reason to optimize, it really gives you a chance to review those documents, including for compliance reasons. And of course, we all like to really know and feel, it's a good feeling to know that we are in compliance, and we know we are. And so again, that as along with point 3 may entail, of course, refiling those documents. And the fifth advantage I have here for optimizing is that it really allows you to transform the way that you communicate with your customers now and in the future. So many people would view this as an advantage, right? We really want to do the best we can in terms of how we're communicating with our customers. I want to show you 2 quick case studies, and they should be quick because we do only have a half hour today. The first case study is something that Belleville worked with in collaboration with a service provider. So there were actually 3 parties involved. There was a health insurer, there was their service provider, and Belvo, who was undertaking the actual migration itself. And in terms of what motivated this particular migration, there was one big reason, and that is that within the print service industry today, there is a lot of consolidation, as you know. There's a lot of buyouts and mergers and those kind of things. And this particular insurer found themselves under a new umbrella that they were not as satisfied with as they were with their old print vendor. So they decided that they were going to transfer their print business to a new vendor. That was the reason for their migration, and here are some reasons why that was a lift and shift migration in this case. First of all, they had a web interface with the previous vendor that they were very fond of. They were very satisfied with it as it was. So it wasn't something that really needed improvement. It was something that needed to be recreated. So that's kind of a common term when we're talking about lift and shift, is we're recreating, in this case, that web interface with a new vendor. As I mentioned, this was also an engagement with several parties. And one of the keys when you're trying to optimize is that communication is absolutely essential. It has to be very direct communication. It has to be very frequent, very in-depth. And of course, the more parties you have involved, the more difficult that can be. In this case, we also had some incomplete requirements, meaning that over the years, it became a little bit unclear as far as all of the different rules and so forth behind all of these documents. And of course, the old print vendor isn't necessarily just going to hand over all of their code and all of their knowledge to the new print vendor. And so in this case, we had some areas where we had to fill it in essentially by using output and trying to reverse engineer these documents in terms of what was the logic behind them and all of that. We went through 16 different BRD versions before all parties were satisfied that we had actually discovered and documented all of the foundational rules behind these documents. And the last point is somewhat related here. We did not, again, have test data that was fully available. And so Belvo actually helped to create test data and did the testing for this particular migration. And the long story short on this particular case study is that if you find yourself spending a lot of time trying to decide where are things now in terms of our documents, right, the logic behind them and so forth, if a lot of time is being spent on deciding just where are things at now and trying to recreate things or reverse engineer things, that leaves a lot less time for any kind of optimization type activities. This second quick case study is something that Belvo did directly with an auto and property insurer. And there were a couple of migration motivators for this insurance company. The first was, I mentioned a little earlier, they had a retirement gap taking place in which essentially the experts from their legacy platform were heading out the door for retirement. And this was something where they didn't have anybody else who knew that system inside and out. Secondly, there was a desire for this insurer for the business to actually own the content, not just to know what the content should be, but to actually have ownership in terms of being able to make edits, to be able to add new content, add new documents, and those kinds of things. And the third reason was that this insurer on their legacy system had what I'll call 3 different sources of truth in terms of the print files or the files for the actual documents that went to customers. First, there was the actual file output that a customer received in the form of a document, but then they had actually separate output for their archive and separate output for a copy that went to the insurance agent. So as you can imagine, you've got these 3 different sources of truth. Potentially they could be different, right? That's possible, and that's not a good situation. And so one motivating factor here of this migration was they needed one source of truth. Whatever went to those customers was also what got archived, and it was what went out to that insurance agent. So this was actually an optimization migration, and a couple of factors that pushed it in that direction. First of all, this insurer wanted to update and share content. They wanted to go through and make sure that content was relevant, compliant for 2021, and they also wanted to make sure that they were only storing that content one time. And so that, of course, relates to the rationalization aspect of these migrations. The second factor here leading to optimization was at the same time they were migrating, they were also doing a rebranding. And they wanted to not only rebrand with confidence, again, with that shared content, knowing that one change to branding is going to cascade to every place it needs to, but also being ensured that if they ever need to rebrand again, that that's going to, again, happen consistently, and they're going to have confidence in that process. The last factor here was this insurer wanted to expand support for different digital channels. And they did actually already have email in place, as many people do, but it was on an actual separate system from, for example, their print output. So they had two different systems kind of taking place there. And the desire was to really get these under one omni-channel solution to be able to expand those channels for the future and really coordinate them together. This is the last slide I have for you, but it's probably going to be the most important one for you and making decisions on these two approaches. I know there's not too much on this slide right now, but we're going to kind of walk our way through some questions that will help you decide, I think, what's the right strategy for me, lift and shift or optimization? And the first question I want you to ask yourself is, what's your budget in dollars and time? And of course, everybody always asks themselves that kind of thing, but I would first of all kind of encourage you to not underestimate the budget and the time that it takes to do these things, because this is something where people tend to kind of discover as they go things that aren't necessarily obvious to them right when they're making those budgets and when they're planning the time. Sometimes those things tend to pop up a little bit later, right? So the next question I have for you, is a system failing right now? Or have you had a system fail and you've been able to get it back up and running, maybe kind of limping along? And if that's the case, that sounds like more of an emergency type situation and probably points more towards the lift and shift approach, at least at first. Another question, and this is a very important one, you have to decide this before you ever start the migration, that is, will the business or will IT own the actual content? We know that IT is going to own the underlying framework and the automation of all of this that's sort of under the hood, but when it comes to the content itself, the words, the branding, the styling, maybe even some of the simple logic behind the content, is the business going to take ownership of that directly, or is IT going to continue to own that? Another question, is your preference for an on-premise type solution or for more of a cloud or a software as a service type licensing model? And many insurers may still prefer to try to keep their CCM solution behind their firewall completely and totally, and may not want to really deal with questions of how do we secure our data in cases of, for example, using the cloud. However, I would also sort of add to this discussion on-premise versus cloud that a lot of the new features that CCM vendors are offering tend to be more located in the cloud. And so if your goals are to really use those new features now and in the future, you'll probably want to think at least about a partially cloud situation. Another big question here for insurers, and you have to again decide this before you start migrating, is are you willing to refile those documents? And if the answer to that question is yes, that really points towards an optimized approach to your migration. Will you incorporate new channels in this platform? Or will you bring channels that are under many different platforms under this new one single omni-channel platform? Again, if that's one of your goals, then that points more towards an optimized approach. And it's not that you couldn't have new channels under the lift and shift approach so much as they may not be quite as integrated or quite as coordinated as they would under the omni-channel approach. The last question here is a very important one. Is your migration tied to customer acquisition or to customer retention? Are you trying to offer a better customer experience as a way of retaining more customers and acquiring more customers? And if the answer to that one is yes, that also very strongly points towards an optimized approach. In closing, I have for you two circles, yellow and purple. And this is kind of like a brainstorming activity again to help us decide these questions. And in yellow, I've got some words that may be going through your head if you're thinking more in terms of optimization. In the purple circle, I have some words that may be going through your head more if you're thinking in terms of a lift and shift type of approach. So let's start with the yellow circle. Are you thinking about trying to transform the way you communicate with your customers now and in the future? Are you trying to bring customer experience to the forefront and really be a customer focused company and trying to differentiate yourself from your competition based on how well you serve your customers? Are you moving more towards omni-channel, again, that bicycle wheel where it's coordinated under one central hub with many different channels coming in and out of it? Are you thinking about empowering your business users, whether those people be the actual content owners or whether you're trying to empower people such as call center employees or maybe agents who are out in the field who may be directly talking to customers and needing to create documents on the fly for those customers based on the feedback that they're getting. And you need to really provide a framework for those people to do that, to customize those documents within a framework. And the last word I've got here for optimizers is, are you thinking about devices? We all have these devices now that we're acquiring, and they all have different screen sizes. They all have different capabilities in terms of how they can display documents. And if you're thinking in terms of how can I make my documents display in an adaptable way on all these different devices so that they'll work no matter what device a person is using, that really points towards optimization. When we think about more of a lift and shift type approach, I would ask you, are you thinking about having more of a heavy IT involvement, not just in the underlying framework of your CCM system, but also in terms of the content itself and managing that? Are you thinking about having channels, multiple channels, but they may not all be in one system, or they may be partly in different places and more of a swim lane type approach? Are cost or time especially important to you and to your migration? If you're especially thinking in terms of budgets and how short a time we can do this in, you may be thinking more in terms of a lift and shift type approach. And the last word in purple I have for you is contain. Are you trying to contain the effects of this migration to a specific area and not be affecting a lot of other departments and stakeholders? So that one is kind of the opposite of the transform in the optimized approach. And then you can see as these circles kind of overlap, we do have three words that fit pretty well into both of these migration approaches. Are you trying to fix something, or are you trying to prevent something from happening that you suspect could happen, right? And you'll see in the center there between those two circles, I have the word digital, because you could go digital in your channels with either of these approaches, and that would work well. I would suggest that with the optimized approach and the omni-channel approach, you would probably have more coordination and a little bit more of the effect of the digital channels that you're looking for if it was done more in an omni-channel way. So those are that's the questions and kind of the brainstorming activity that I hope will help everyone decide what approach is best for them. And I also want to kind of mention that if you're thinking in terms of, I may want to go towards the optimized type approach if that's kind of what you're thinking now, the next step in that process is going to be to decide, what does optimization look like for your company, for your organization? Because it doesn't always look the same for everyone. It really depends on what your needs are, and it depends on what your goals are for now and for the future. And so, Belleville can not only help you decide these things and talk about what optimization would look like for you, but also we can help actually, implement these solutions with you. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Hanson again and see if we have any questions.
Thank you, James. Looks like we have time for a couple of questions. And one that I have here is, where do you draw the line between IT responsibilities and business user ownership?
Okay, that's interesting. So we've talked a lot about how you could empower the business through both of these migration approaches, and especially the optimization approach. And as far as drawing the line, again, that kind of depends on how much of this your business is wanting to take on for themselves. But generally, I would say that the underlying framework of any CCM system is going to be built and maintained more by the IT side, and that includes things such as integration points with other systems. It oftentimes includes things like, doing data transformations, handling all of the permissions that are in place to say what users can edit what documents, or what users can do what where. IT tends to handle more of the, especially the automation side of things. So all of that's under the hood of any CCM system in terms of getting the right documents to the right people, and all of that automation, I would say, is definitely an IT task, as well as the deployment of any changes to different environments and that kind of thing. When it comes to the business side, I would say that the business really, today we see a lot of the business wanting to just own directly the content itself. And so that has to do with not only just the words, but the branding and the styling, and potentially even some of the rules that have to do with what paragraph is shown on a given document, right? And the rules behind that. Those are things that the business actually knows better than IT does, right? So the business knows what these documents are supposed to look like, and IT knows more about how to automate them and get them to the right people. So that's where I would really try to draw the line, is at the content aspect of it.
Another question that we have here: of the two approaches that you brought up today, are you seeing a trend for either approach? Are more companies taking one approach on versus the other?
I think it's quite mixed, and it really depends on, again, the goals of each company, because one approach isn't going to fit everybody. So you really have to kind of look at those questions we talked about, think about what words are kind of going through your mind, and that will really, I think, help you decide which approach is best for you.
Well, it looks like we're closing in on the half hour. I'd like to thank everyone for attending. You will receive a follow-up email with a link to this valuable information. Please contact us at info@bellevue.com with any specific questions you may have regarding migration or all things communication. You can catch us next time, where we'll be delving into the optimization method much further. And please don't hesitate to contact us. Also, you can reach me at hanson.longfellow@bellevue.com. And we're looking forward to talking to you again.
Thanks, everyone.